You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. When city workers go out to address a tent encampment where homeless people are living, advocates say that often the people living there aren't getting the services that they need, and their belongings are thrown away.
I've lost a lot of stuff. I've had to start over numerous times. I couldn't even count them on my hands.
And what kinds of services are being offered can significantly affect how many people actually end up going indoors instead of just being moved a few streets over.
There'd been a lot of COVID outbreaks at shelters, and so there's understandably been a little bit of resistance from people about moving into these congregate shelters during a pandemic. So you saw that number drop from about 85% of people who were accepting services to move indoors to about 30% when it was just congregate being offered.
I'm Laura Wennis, and this is Civic.
Thank you for calling the City and County of San Francisco 311 Customer Service Center.
When someone calls 311 because of a tent encampment, chances are pretty good that the request for service will ultimately be routed to something in the city called HSOC. This is an acronym for the Healthy Streets Operations Center, a collaboration between several different city departments, including Public Works, the police, the health department, and the homelessness department. It's all under the umbrella of the Department of Emergency Management, where it was moved in 2019, but the center originally came out of an initiative at Mission Police Station. This center, HSOC, has a pretty monumental and complex job, something called encampment resolutions. The idea is that people who live in an encampment get a heads up that the city will be cleaning it and that they'll need to leave. Then, sanitation workers with Public Works, some police officers, homeless outreach team members, and others show up and theoretically offer services like getting connected to a shelter bed or medical care or even substance use treatment, while they're told they need to vacate and the area is cleaned. For a long time now, advocates have been saying this isn't necessarily how it goes. And a few weeks ago, the Coalition on Homelessness released a report alleging that for most people in these camps, the resolutions don't connect them to the services they need. And many people living in these encampments and observers from the coalition say that often people's stuff is just taken and trashed. I invited the director of the Healthy Streets Operations Center onto the program to talk about this report. I was told he'd need to get permission, then that he hadn't heard anything back, and then I stopped hearing from him. So unfortunately, we don't get to hear city government's side of this today. Here's how a few people who have experienced what the coalition is talking about describe what happens, as told to coalition member Kelly Cutler and independent photographer Robert Gumpert.
Hello, my name is Jamie Arreguin, and this interview is about the city doing the sweeps on homeless people. They ain't got nowhere to go, and they keep moving us from one place to another without giving us housings. They talking about we're refusing services, but we're not, because they're not offering services. They want to put us in a shelter where there's a pandemic going on, and there's 100 people in there, and somebody might catch COVID, and we all gonna get it. Also, like, they're not offering us the service. They just keep coming over here, taking our stuff, throwing it away, threatening us going to jail if we don't move. We keep losing everything. They're supposed to tag and bag our stuff, but they never do that. They just came in and just grab it, happy, and just throw it on the truck, and just we lose everything every time.
My name's Mia Caballero. With the DPW, everybody knows if you're not home, you lost everything. It doesn't matter what's in your tent. You know, I know me personally, like, I keep it in my backpack, but I have my mom's ashes, I have my dog's ashes. People have really personal objects, and it's thrown away. It's never bagged and tagged like they say. It's never anything like that. If you're not home, they throw it away.
One of the people Robert talked to didn't want to give her name. She'd just been offered a placement by the city, and at this point in the conversation, Robert had just asked her what her most important belongings were.
My clothing and my knives, my pepper sprays and things like that, because I use them for everything, including protecting myself from weirdos, and without my clothes I couldn't protect myself from weirdos either, and I'd be walking around naked. At this point, I'm desperate just to be safe and have somewhere where I can go to be safe and warm and have my things not be stolen from me every day.
It's worth noting that these are mostly voices of people who didn't get a shelter offer or who might have turned it down for reasons that we'll get into in a moment. But some, of course, do get the offer and do take it. Advocates advise people living on the streets to do that because you can't just show up to a shelter and ask to get in. They're mostly full, and the only way to get a spot is through a referral, often from HSOC, the people clearing the encampments. The coalition's report covers a lot of ground. It draws on the city's own data, documents unearthed by a local public records sleuth who goes by the Twitter handle HDiz, and observations by activists who show up to these operations. And they allege not just that the operations center doesn't do a good job of actually connecting people to services, but that its practices are illegal. Just for some context here, the coalition is a highly visible advocacy group, and one that has the freedom to often criticize the city and its policies.
The Coalition on Homelessness does not contract with the city, and that makes them particularly unique in San Francisco. The vast majority of nonprofits serving people experiencing homelessness in the city do receive funding from the city to operate their programs and their services, and that can make it a little bit scary to come out against city policies when they are helping to pay your staff and workers and the people that you are serving. And so the coalition is unique in that it does not take any city funds.
This is Nuala Bashari, my colleague at the San Francisco Public Press, who covers homelessness and city policies responding to it. She's been covering HSOC since it launched in 2018, and she was the first to cover the report when it came out. What does resolving an encampment mean?
So there's a few different interpretations of this. So resolving encampments is the city's term for it. What we commonly hear more often are camp sweeps or encampment sweeps. Encampment resolutions often entail members from these different city departments showing up at a homeless camp and theoretically offering services, helping people move their belongings, and often just moving them from one street corner to another. There is an opportunity during these resolutions to help people get connected to services, but they're often called in to move an encampment along, to clean up a camp that is either blocking a sidewalk or just in a place that people don't want it to be.
And what's with this term sweep? I think a while ago, like at the beginning of the pandemic, we were hearing, oh, the city doesn't do sweeps. Why is this such a controversial term?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that I've struggled with a lot in my reporting. I've been writing about HSOC since 2018, and I've learned over these years that whenever I talk to the city, if I say, hey, I'm calling to talk about a sweep, they say, oh, we don't do sweeps. We do encampment resolutions. And it really just comes down to terminology, but it has become a kind of differential between the way the city views what is happening during these operations and the ways that advocates and people experiencing homelessness view these. And those are two very, very different perspectives on what is happening here.
Mm-hmm. So you reported that, according to the Department of Emergency Management, in the year ending this June, HSOC cleared 79 camps where 4,648 people lived. So, like, more than 4,000. And this department says about 45% of those people accepted offers of shelter. I'll let you expand on that first. What does that tell us or suggest that less than half of people who lived in encampments that were cleared accepted offers of shelter?
I think actually that specific percentage is pretty problematic. So what you're looking for is June 2020 to June 2021. That's the period of time in which this data was collected. And so 45% of people accepting services, I mean, depending on how you look at it, might seem good. But when you actually get down to a month-by-month breakdown, there's an enormous discrepancy. So in June 2020, when this data was first being collected, the city was still offering people shelter-in-place hotel rooms to help mitigate the spread of COVID and bring people who were very vulnerable medically to catching COVID and to having, disastrous side effects of COVID indoors. And so they were moving people into vacant tourist hotels, and people were pretty into that. I mean, being told, we can get you off the streets and into a hotel room where you have a shower and a door that locks and a comfy bed. So during that time period, about 85% of people that the Healthy Streets Operations Center were encountering on the streets were accepting offers of shelter, which is pretty high. But by December of 2020, it was a totally different game. The city had stopped doing intakes for shelter-in-place hotels, and they were only offering people congregate shelters. So those are the huge kind of warehouse-style shelter beds situations, and that was pretty scary for people. There'd been a lot of COVID outbreaks at shelters. There was one that happened early on in the pandemic where more than 90 people at a shelter contracted COVID. And so there's understandably been a little bit of resistance from people about moving into these congregate shelters during a pandemic. So you saw that number drop from about 85% of people who are accepting services to move indoors to about 30% when it was just congregate being offered. So looking at that aggregate number of 45% over a year, it doesn't actually tell a very clear story of what was happening on the streets and what was being offered to people.
And it just makes it extra clear how important it is to ask what the services are that are being offered when we talk about people who don't want services, right?
Exactly, yes.
So let's say that people do want to go to congregate shelter, even in the pandemic. And for the majority of people who are asked, it's actually better than living on the street, especially now that we've had some rain and it's getting colder. Could the city even accommodate that?
No, unfortunately they couldn't. I mean, the shelter system in San Francisco, the congregate shelter system, has always, even pre-pandemic, not had the capacity to meet the needs of people living on the streets. Back when we used to have a shelter wait list, which nonprofits could use to put people on to a list to get a bed, there was seldom a time where there were less than 1,000 people sitting on that shelter wait list. So I want to be clear that we've never had the capacity to meet that demand. But right now, due to COVID restrictions, we have reduced capacity in a lot of our shelters, and anytime that there are positive cases in these shelters, they pause intakes. And so it's really, really hard to get into a shelter right now. And there aren't a lot of beds. But the sweeps are continuing. So what is happening now is that the city has said, we don't have enough shelter beds for everybody who is in these encampments. But we have looked at the numbers and determined that approximately 30 to 40% of people during these encampment resolutions are accepting offers for congregate shelter. And so that is actually all we need to have available in our pocket when we go out to do a sweep. It's 30 to 40% of the encampment population's that amount, if that makes sense.
The person who recently took over as director of HSOC, his name is Sam Dodge, told Nuala for her story that this formula adapts. It changes every week. In early October, when he and Nuala talked, HSOC teams went out with enough shelter beds open to accommodate about 40% of any encampment at minimum. And if teams are in a place where a lot of people are accepting offers of shelter beds, but not enough are available, the team will just return the next day. I was hoping for more detail on this and invited Sam onto the show for an interview. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But it's not just the formula that the Coalition on Homelessness alleges is resulting in those low numbers of people who are living in encampments getting connected to services when HSOC shows up. It's the whole process, including the timing. This came up at a recent meeting of the local Homeless Coordinating Board. That board is an advisory body to the city's Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing. Here's how Carlos Watkins, a human rights organizer with the coalition, described a typical HSOC operation to that board. You'll hear him refer to the HOT team. That's the city's homeless outreach team.
A quick version of what happens in an HSOC resolution is that somewhere between 7 and 7:30 in the morning, it begins. And what that means is that HOT team workers go through the encampment and kind of wake people up in their tents, tell them, hey, we're doing a resolution today. You're going to have to leave this area. And at that time, HOT team doesn't have access to any specific shelter offers. They couldn't say, we have a bed in Embassy South for you, or we have a hotel room for you. So what they do is they kind of take names and information and maybe do like an assessment of who might want shelter. Once that's done, immediately DPW begins their cleaning operation. So they begin cleaning the street, they begin telling people to pack their belongings, handing out trash bags, having people start moving. So basically the displacement, the sweep has begun right after HOT team comes through. The problem is that HOT team doesn't actually get their shelter offers until after 9, and usually closer to 9:30. Around 9:30, the shelter beds do come, and HOT team is able to offer shelter beds to people. The problem with that is, one, like I said, folks are already being moved and maybe are on the next block looking to see where they can find their tent, or helping a neighbor move their tent, or packing their belongings. And so they might not be able to talk to HOT team at that time. Also, this is 2 hours later. A lot of folks have already just left. They've already just moved their belongings and are gone. It's kind of this chaotic period of like there's shelter beds being offered, there's cleaning happening, folks are being kind of harassed and told to move. If folks are moving too slowly, they might be threatened by SFPD to have citations. It's like a very chaotic environment, and it's not hard to see like why that's not good for having a good success rate of placing people with resources, right?
I want to linger on this meeting for a minute. The local homeless coordinating board. Because while the coalition's report originally came out in early October, it was just this week that Carlos, who you just heard from, was making this presentation to the board, known as the LHCB. And since this is a public hearing, there were people waiting to comment on what had just been presented. Among them was Kristen Evans, literary entrepreneur, bookstore owner, and someone who back in July got arrested at an HSOC operation.
Hi, this is Kristen Evans. I've done a lot of outreach to folks on the street, and as you guys may recall, I was actually arrested. The person that we were trying to assist into an appropriate housing offer is still out on the street, pregnant woman who has a baby due in January. That was back in July. The solutions that HSOC has to offer are always insufficient for a number of people. And for them to say that people are declining services is inaccurate. As the data revealed is what we knew from firsthand experience on the street, which is that HSOC does not have the resources that are needed to end people's homelessness. I'm really disappointed that we didn't get to hear from the 8 people experiencing homelessness tonight in this rain, to hear about their experience with HSOC firsthand, because I have a tendency to believe that you're not going to listen to the what you call the soccer mom from Noe Valley. I'm like the bookstore owner from Haight-Ashbury. I think you want to hear it from the people on the street that are experiencing it day in, day out. And let's make sure we get that public comment and that sound fixed. Thank you.
About that sound, here's what had happened. One of the members of this coordinating board is Kelly Cutler, who I mentioned earlier. She's both a board member and works with the Coalition on Homelessness, and she does a lot of outreach work for them. She said that because the board's meetings, which are on WebEx, aren't very accessible to people living out on the street, she went and brought the hearing to them. This is Kelly.
Since this meeting hasn't really been accessible for folks that are out there, gone out and collected the public comments from folks about HSOC so they could share what the experience is like directly for them. So Charles has that lined up so he can, in his audio. So.
And how long is this video?
The answer to that is about 17 minutes, but it ultimately didn't matter how long it was because technical difficulties prevented the sound from playing, which led to this exchange.
If we can't get this online here, I suggest that we move this questions. I know you're shaking your head, but
this meeting is not accessible to people experiencing homelessness. Like, come on, this is ridiculous. Like, it's pushed off. This happens every time. I'm
not trying to end the meeting. I'm trying to move the meeting on because there's other people waiting also.
I can't play you the full 17 minutes, but here are a few more examples of what Kelly and Robert, the photographer who helped capture some of this audio, heard from people about HSOC.
My name is Angel Amador. People are not resistant to assistance. If they were given proper assistance, then they would be all for it. But what they are being given is tent cities. And if there were proper, the same thing that you or I would want, like a safe place to call home that you can, maybe even lock. And while doing that, get vocational training of some sort that could get you to the point to where you could get into a low-income housing and have the resources to work and the knowledge to work and take care of yourself, then there wouldn't be a homeless problem anymore.
My name is Andrew J. Howard, and this is my story. I arrived in San Francisco in December 23rd of 2019, and shortly after that, as a result of the pandemic, I was homeless. I landed on the streets of San Francisco, and I was living in various shelters and tents, and then the pandemic came, and I was in a shelter-in-place situation. And shortly after that, I was harassed by DPW, where they took all of my belongings, everything I was using to try and make money to survive and get food and exist. And they stripped me of every personal item that I owned without any warning. One morning when I was on Jesse Alley, they pulled up with a trash truck and several workers, and they just started throwing everything into the truck and crushing it. I lost my personal effects, all my ID, and because of that, I couldn't qualify for any stimulus or unemployment benefits as a result of their activity.
Any type of services had debate, whether I take it or not, because the people who are coming to see us, they're asking us to leave. They're coming with the police. They're coming with garbage trucks, telling us we got to go. Tents aren't going to be allowed up. And then they said, but we'll send you to Tent City. Okay, I can't sleep on the street in a tent, but you're going to put me somewhere where I can be in the street, in a tent.
My name is Samuel Roberts. I've lost a lot of stuff. I've had to start over numerous times. I couldn't even count them on my hands. And, oh, man. I can't even think clearly about how they messed me up. Every time that they've done their sweeps, the cops would come and say, okay, we're going to have a sweep tomorrow or whatever, And sure enough, like 4 o'clock in the morning, they come and roust everybody up, and DPW comes in and just takes everything. And we just have to sit there on the sidelines, and just watch them do it. It wasn't cool, man, because it's like they're taking stuff that I work for, and Sorry. A lot of stuff that really meant a lot to me, but every time they come to us, they say, okay, you want to go to a shelter? Last 2 times I said yes, right? And they said, well, you can only take 2 bags and a bicycle, right? I'm like, I got way more stuff than 2 bags and a bicycle. So what happens to all of my other stuff? Oh, DPW takes it. I go, and then what? I take a loss on it, and they're like, yeah, there's nothing we can do about that.
Samuel's story illustrates one of the reasons why someone might get the offer of a shelter bed and not take it. There are restrictions. But of course, there's also people who can live with those restrictions. And as I heard at this board meeting pretty frequently, there aren't enough spaces in shelters. Here's board co-chair Del Seymour earlier in the meeting voicing his frustration about the city's shelter capacity. You'll also hear Chief Deputy Director of the Homelessness Department, Noel Simmons, responding.
And I know everyone on the board isn't with me on this, but understanding why we have not opened a higher capacity in our congregate shelters. The Warriors Stadium, which is run by San Francisco, the Giants Stadium, they're at full 100% capacity. And those are just rich folks going to a damn basketball game. It's raining right now. I'm looking outside, it's raining right now. I don't understand how the city can do one venue and not the other, because one is run by rich folks who want a chance to see Steph Curry, and my folks are just more or less nobodies considered by the city, that they just lay on the sidewalk. I mean, it's almost like, who cares?
Given the ongoing COVID pandemic, one thing I will say is that while vaccination rates are over 80% in San Francisco generally, the vaccination rates vary by subpopulation, and we know that our homeless population's vaccination rate is under 50%. In recent months, we have seen a number of active outbreaks at our shelters, and when an outbreak occurs, we do have to close that shelter until we have no new cases for a 2-week period of time, which further reduces shelter capacity. And so it really is a balancing act.
So there aren't always enough beds, even more so because the congregate shelters need to operate at limited capacity. We've already talked about the formula that HSOC uses to determine whether they can go out and do an operation without enough beds for everyone in an encampment. That formula raises some questions under a legal paradigm. A Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision in 2018 known as Martin v. Boise. Let's go back to Nuala.
And that has raised some pretty serious legal concerns, especially when looking at a really famous law, a federal law called Martin versus Boise. It rules that cities cannot enforce anti-camping ordinances if they do not have enough shelter beds available. And so this was a situation in Boise where the city shelters had shut down and 6 people were cited for sleeping outdoors. And this case got a lot of attention, and it was ultimately ruled that you cannot cite someone criminally for experiencing homelessness if you don't have beds for them that are available. And you can't conduct these huge operations and move people along if you don't have beds available. And so what is really at play here is what enough means. Is it 30% of a camp? If that's your average acceptance rate for congregate shelter, is 30% enough? Or is the city legally bound to have enough shelter beds for everyone in an encampment before they sweep it? And so that would be a really tricky situation for San Francisco to face, right? Where we know that we do not have enough shelter beds for everybody in the city. And so let's say on any given moment, we have 20 shelter beds available. That means the city could never do a clearing of more than 20 people in one day. I want people to really understand the scale at which these operations are happening. I think there was a narrative in the beginning of the pandemic that these sweeps were not occurring, and this data has absolutely proved otherwise. I mean, we're seeing between 700 and 800 people being swept in a single month while Delta is surging. I mean, it's massive operations that are occurring every single day in the city. And so for those to stop would be pretty enormous from both a visual perspective. I think encampments would get a lot larger, and then also just from a kind of stability perspective. I think people who are not being swept as much would have a very different experience of being outdoors and not having to constantly reclaim their belongings.
The city has actually already seen a lawsuit over its practices of clearing encampments, specifically a process called bag and tag. This policy says that when city workers are cleaning up an area and pick up someone's belongings, they're supposed to put those belongings in a bag, mark it with the location and date of the operation, and give the owner an identifying tag. Then the owner can come retrieve their belongings at a later date from the public works yard.
This process has been pretty problematic from the get-go. I covered this a couple of years ago where people are having a really hard time getting their belongings back. And it's because of many reasons. The public works yard is in a pretty inaccessible place to get to. It's not served by a lot of bus lines. The hours are pretty limited. People will show up with their tag and it will sometimes take staff, 2-3 hours to find their belongings if they even can find them. So the storage system is pretty sloppy. And what this report from the Coalition on Homelessness suggests is they looked at all of the bag and tag forms and the addresses of where items were taken during a 2-month period, January and February of this year. And they compared those with the addresses where all of the sweeps took place that were operated by HSOC, and they found 0 overlaps. And so during these encampment sweep operations, the city, if there are unclaimed belongings, are supposed to be bagging them up and tagging them and helping people reclaim them at a later date. But it seems like that didn't happen during any encampment resolution in January and February. So there's long been claims that the city is, stealing belongings or throwing people's belongings away, and the city will respond to that and say, no, we have this bag and tag policy. But it's just another major discrepancy between what people are witnessing and experiencing and what the city says is actually happening.
A few individuals who have experienced this kind of thing, a sweep like this, have filed suit about what happened to them, and a judge actually found that they were wronged by the city. Who are those folks, and what did the judge say?
There were 10 people who were part of a large encampment in the Bayview who were swept in January of 2020, so pre-pandemic. And this was a camp that had been along kind of disused railroad tracks for more than a year. It was a pretty large camp, and the residents there claimed that they were given no notice, that no one came by with flyers, that no one informed them that the sweep was happening. And instead, they were woken on the morning of January 8th by police kind of opening their tent saying, everybody out, come stand over here. And so they did what they were told. And the police wouldn't let them go back to their tents to claim their belongings. And so there was someone who said, I need my prescription medication. And they said, too bad, you can't go get it. And an hour after they were pulled away from their tents, the Department of Public Works showed up and the city showed up with a bulldozer that actually swept their belongings, and they were not able to claim them. And so they reached out to the Coalition on Homelessness, who brought in the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, who addressed the case, looked at the situation, and filed a suit against the city based off of 10 of the plaintiffs' statements. And they actually won. It took a really long time. That ruling was only made in August of this year, so we're talking more than a year later, well more than a year later. But a judge actually ruled, the city did not give adequate notice, the items were not bagged and tagged, and so each of these plaintiffs were awarded $10,000, which is a lot of money if you're experiencing homelessness. Unfortunately, that money may not actually ever get to them because the city has appealed the case, and so it is still tied up in the courts.
Nuala's reporting suggests it's unlikely that this is the end of the city's legal challenges on this topic. The city has appealed that $100,000 ruling, but the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights has been paying close attention to the city's practices of clearing encampments, and has signaled that its lawyers may bring another challenge.
I think that, Martin versus Boise is really a pending lawsuit. I think that, I don't know if they'll file it or someone will file it, but I think that interpretation over the amount of shelter beds that needs to be made available in order to conduct an encampment sweep, that is going to end up in our courts. I would not be surprised if it didn't happen in the next year. And then, the bag and tags, I think, are also an enormous issue. People are protected under the Fourth Amendment of having their items seized, and that is exactly what is happening during a lot of these encampment sweeps, and so that's another area. And then the 14th Amendment requires due process, such as notice before a cleanup begins. And so if the city is not offering proper notification to people that a sweep is happening, they could be in violation of that as well. So there are a lot of ways in which this can be tackled from a legal perspective. I think one of the tricky things will be being up against the city of San Francisco's incredibly talented team of lawyers, and then also finding people experiencing homelessness who are willing and able to chase something like this for possibly years on end. One of the things that made this situation particularly unique is that there were 10 people who were willing to fight for their rights. And that is so rare in San Francisco. And so I talked to one of the plaintiffs, Jason Hill, who hadn't been experiencing homelessness for that long. And he was one of the people who was really trying to organize his community after the sweep to file this lawsuit, or its small claim suit. And he told me, he said, I was trying to rally the rest of the people, and people were just walking off and not fighting it. I realized this was nothing new to anyone there. This was not anybody's first time having everything they had stolen. People were used to it, they took it, and they just walked off. They don't feel like they have rights. And so I think that this is such a regular occurrence that having the necessary amount of outrage to fight it is becoming more and more rare. And also from a legal perspective, it's getting more and more tricky to track people down if they're constantly being swept. You know, people don't have cell phones. And so if you're trying to follow up with them to appear in court, that in itself is tricky. And so the very system that they're trying to fight is also stymieing the process of fighting it.
That was reporter Nuala Bishari. Read her reporting at sfpublicpress.org. The Coalition on Homelessness report concludes with 9 recommendations for how the city could improve its approach, including lowering the barriers to entry for shelters, focusing on people rather than tents in data and prioritization, putting more people in shelter-in-place hotels, and organizing regular cleanups and trash pickups at encampment sites. You can read the Coalition's full report at cohsf.org. I'm Laura Wennis, and you've been listening to Civic. Civic comes to you from KSFP-LP at 102.5 FM in San Francisco. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Our team includes producer and contributor Mel Baker and assistant producer Liana Wilcox. KSFP is a project of the San Francisco Public Press, a nonprofit investigative newsroom. Find our reporting at sfpublicpress.org. Our staff here includes publisher Lila LaHood, executive director Michael Stoll, assistant editor Noah Arroyo, copy chief Kurt Aguilar, photojournalist and reporter Jessica Prado, and reporter Nuala Bishari. Civic airs Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on KSFP. New episodes every Thursday. Thanks for listening.